Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Bill Roggio, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, about the rising terror threat in Africa, Iran's network of proxies in the Middle East, and how the U.S. lost hearts and minds in the war on terror era. And then we dive into the latest on the Russia-Ukraine war, the threat from Chinese organized criminal activity in Mexico, and growing anti-war, and some would say anti-Semitic, protests on American college campuses. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I am your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent here at the Washington Times, and I'm joined, as always, by Guy Taylor, my esteemed co-host and the national security editor here at the Times. Packed show again this week, Guy. We got Bill Roggio from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies coming up with a great interview. But first things first, what's on your radar this week?
Great to be here, Ben. There are a couple things that are barely getting a mention in the NatSec media space, but should be paid attention to. One of them is how China has quietly announced a pretty major reorganization of the People's Liberation Army. It was unveiled about a week ago in Beijing, where Chinese state media announced that a new strategic service arm has been created within the PLA to take control of Chinese military information warfare. This new information support force will evidently replace or revamp what was previously known as the PLA's broader strategic support force that had been coordinating information, cyber, and space warfare activities on behalf of the ruling Chinese Communist Party. This reorganization is interesting on a couple fronts. First, I'm trying to figure out what the role of Chinese intelligence, specifically the Ministry of State Security, is within the reorganization. And then second, there's surging concern within the U.S. national security community over Chinese disinformation operations worldwide, operations that promote narratives across media and social media in many languages that the U.S. is a bad actor on the global stage, that democracy doesn't work, that the U.S. is weak or in decline, and so on. These narratives impact public opinion in the global South, but also in the United States. Consider the whole TikTok debate in Washington. U.S. sources say TikTok puts such messaging before young American audiences, and that TikTok's China-based parent company ByteDance has ties to the Ministry of State Security. Of course, President Biden just signed a new U.S. law that will either ban TikTok from the American social media space or force ByteDance, the parent company, to sell TikTok to presumably a U.S. tech giant within 1 year. So I'm sure we're going to be talking about that going forward. A second thing, Ben, the resurgence of attacks in recent days on commercial shipping by Iran-supported Houthi militants in Yemen. We saw these attacks drop off in recent weeks amid the direct escalation between Israel and Iran, but now suddenly they're back. The Houthis circulated a video this week saying they're carrying out fresh attacks on U.S. and Israeli vessels in the Red Sea. U.S. Central Command put out a statement of its own saying its naval coalition that's patrolling the Red Sea had neutralized an anti-ship ballistic missile fired from Houthi territory in Yemen. My question here is whether the Houthi resurgence has been ordered by Iran, or does it signal that Iran is shifting back now to using proxies following the harrowing past few weeks in which Iran itself carried out a direct strike against Israel? Remember, my threat of the week last week was the prospect of a surge in Israel-Hezbollah clashes. Now I'm weighing how the Houthis might factor into that.
Well, this is sort of safer, more familiar territory for Iran, right? To rely on these groups, these militias in Iraq and Syria, the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, to sort of do its bidding for it, rather than the direct clashes between Israel and Iran that we were all worried about last week. Guy, I want to turn to Ukraine for a minute because there's a lot going on here. You mentioned the bill that President Biden signed. This, of course, is a broader foreign aid package that about $95 billion, including $61 billion for Ukraine. Now, this is a big deal because there's been a noticeable split in the Republican Party that we've talked about here on the show to Ukraine aid, and House Speaker Mike Johnson had to rely on Democratic votes to help get this across the finish line. And we'll explore that and what it means for the Republican Party and presidential politics in the weeks ahead as the November election gets closer. But right now, Guy, I'm not sure how much I believe in coincidences, but I don't think it was an accident that was right around the time that this bill was finally making its way through Congress that we got this little revelation seemingly out of nowhere that Ukraine apparently has been using long-range ballistic missiles from the U.S., the Army Tactical Missile System, more known as ATACMS, that apparently the U.S. provided secretly back in February. And it's already been used. It was used by the Ukrainian military to bomb a Russian military airfield in Crimea. So this is something Ukraine's been asking for. We've had guests on the show who have said, why aren't we giving ATACMS to Ukraine? Apparently, we already have, and we're going to give more of them as part of this aid package. This has led to a situation that I think would actually be kind of funny if it weren't so serious, which is you've had lawmakers going on national television saying, why are we giving ATACMS to Ukraine? And apparently they didn't know that they were already there. Why was it done this way? It's a theme that I think listeners of this show are probably pretty familiar with by now, which is the Biden administration makes its decisions based on fear of escalation. Admiral Christopher Grady, who's the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, told the Associated Press in an interview just this week after the Ukraine bill, the foreign aid bill, passed the House, that the administration looked carefully at the risks of sending ATACMS and decided now is the time to do it. He said, quote, I think the time is right. And the boss, President Biden, made the decision the time is right to provide these based on where the fight is now. I think it was a very well-considered decision. We really wrung it out. But again, anytime you introduce a new system, any change into a battlefield, you have to think through the escalatory nature of it, unquote. Why do we keep doing this? I mean, immediately after the Ukraine aid package passed the House, this is what Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said, quote, the Westerners are teetering dangerously on the brink of a direct military clash between nuclear powers, which is fraught with catastrophic consequences, unquote. Is it an accident that he said this? Of course not, because they read the U.S. media. Maybe Lavrov listens to the Threat Status podcast, Guy, and knows that these wild threats, this fear of escalation, seems to be the main thing influencing Biden administration policy when it comes to Ukraine.
Domestic politics, Ben. We talked with former CIA clandestine services officer Daniel Hoffman last week about this fear of escalation in the current administration. We also talked more broadly about the politics behind the failure of U.S. deterrence on the global stage in recent years and how it's emboldening adversaries. I wonder how it also affects U.S. allies, such as Israel. We can explore that further in upcoming episodes, but I want to get to our great guest.
And we are joined now by Bill Roggio. He's a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. Bill, thanks so much for being on the show here. I want to start off at the top with a developing story. There's a host of U.S. officials who are in Niger right now, this week, as we record the show, to, quote, initiate discussions on an orderly and safe withdrawal of U.S. forces from Niger, according to the Pentagon. Of course, the ruling military junta in Niger, as we've discussed before, once U.S. troops gone, that presumably means the end of our drone base, at least as we know it, in Niger. So this is a pretty big deal. What is this going to mean, Bill, for our ability to combat terrorist groups in the Sahel and the whole of Africa?
Gentlemen, thanks for having me on. And yes, this is a very important issue. This has been boiling over since the junta kicked off last year. And this is really bad because the Islamic State, as well as Al-Qaeda, both have made significant gains, particularly in Mali, as well as in sub-Saharan African countries. They're only going to grow. This is like the pun intended, I guess, the booming theater for Islamist terrorists. You know, it's funny. I remember my mom asking me, telling a mom story, but about 17 years ago, where do you think the next really big area of terrorist operations will be? And I said, Africa. I said, North and Sahel Africa. And that really has come to true. I mean, we've seen Al-Qaeda succeed in Afghanistan. The Islamic State have success in the Middle East, Al-Qaeda as well with Yemen. But what has gone on in Africa particularly in the last decade, we've seen areas that really weren't a threat or had insignificant threats become very significant. So back to that base, losing that really inhibits the U.S. and the West's ability to at least even just to monitor these terror groups. And then you have the Russians moving in. that's a whole different problem set where the US and the West is losing influence in Africa and Russia and China gaining Africa in those regions as well. And they're not going to be as concerned about terrorist organizations, more about profits and gains and relationships.
No, Bill, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I was going to say, so do we have, would you say we actually have an actual counterterrorism strategy in Africa right now? You and I have talked before about how the administration and prior administrations as well just want to keep a lid on al-Shabaab, for example, in Somalia, rather than actually defeat them in the traditional sense. I mean, that seems to be true across the Sahel as well. Is there a coherent big picture plan here, or are we just playing whack-a-mole with these groups?
If keeping a lid on the problem is a strategy, well, then that's really been our strategy, and it's a failing strategy. It's one that over time, these groups just continue to gain ground. They're weak countries throughout Africa where they gain space, and playing whack-a-mole, killing a terrorist leader. I always say it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. We learned this in Afghanistan. We learned this in Iraq. We learned this in Pakistan. We killed lots of terrorist leaders. This is why, and the Israelis as well, right? They've killed a lot of terrorist leaders in Gaza, in Lebanon, and in Syria, and yet these groups persist. Counterterrorism operations do not work against groups that essentially have armies and have political movements and social movements behind them. These groups are more than just cellular terrorist organizations. They are insurgencies, and fighting using counterterrorism tactics and strategy against an insurgent enemy is a failure.
Bill, it's Guy. We all of us who are coming of age as either journalists or analysts in the national security space in the 9/11 era know that the entire global narrative around Islamic extremist terrorism can change overnight if there's a shocking attack like 9/11. What do you think about what's going on with ISIS-K right now? ISIS-K kind of poked its finger onto the global consciousness a few weeks ago with the attack on the Moscow concert hall. How concerned are you about the external attack and external operations capability of this group? It's like it's in Syria, sort of, but it's really the Afghanistan component.
Yeah, there's two threats that emanate from Afghanistan. The Islamic State Khorasan province, or ISIS-K, as it's often called, ISKP, is one. It has thousands of fighters. The Islamic State is very keen on conducting mass casualty attacks or high profile attacks in order to raise its profile. But the other threat is the one that always bothers me more, and that's the Taliban Al-Qaeda alliance. Because why is that? The Taliban controls a country. It controls all of the weapons and ammunition and fuel and bases that we left behind. And it's allied with Al-Qaeda, another global terrorist organization that is more patient. Al-Qaeda runs 10 terrorist training camps in 10 provinces. And the United Nations Security Council Analytical Support and Monitoring Team has been very clear in detailing this over the last several years. So you have a dual threat there. The Taliban and the Islamic State are enemies. One of the problems that I have, the Islamic State, I expect it to launch attacks in the region or it could possibly extend its tendrils into Western Europe. It's even possible to conduct an attack in the United States. We have to remember that terrorist attacks are merely a tactic. Their overarching goal is to take over countries in the process of reestablishing their global caliphate. And this is what worries me more about Al-Qaeda than the Islamic State. The Islamic State is, in some ways, that's a lash-out attack that brings a lot of heat on it. Groups like the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, that alliance, Al-Qaeda looks more long-term. They already have a state within their caliphate, or an emirate within their caliphate. That's the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. And Somalia could be another one. Mali may be another one as well. So ISIS-K, its threat is conducting attacks in the near term. I look at the enemy that's more patient, that has more of a long-term strategy. That's the Al-Qaeda with its allies. That's the one that worries me more. And that is not by any means to discount the threat, to downplay the threat that the Islamic State poses.
Totally. I think I actually want to follow that with, we were told by the Biden administration when U.S. forces pulled out of Afghanistan in 2021 that the U.S. intelligence community and the Pentagon retained intelligence gather over the horizon intelligence gathering capabilities and strike capabilities. You're a journalist, but you know these issues as well as most government intel analysts. Do you think that we actually the United States has those capabilities right now with our partners? What is your take on that? Were we lied to, given that we no longer control Bagram Air Base and have a significant intelligence gathering footprint in Afghanistan? How capable is the U.S. military and intelligence community to confront the resurgence of an Islamic State connected group?
Well, first, the Biden administration lied to us about the Taliban, about its intentions, about what Afghanistan would look like after withdrawal. And as far as our abilities to gather intelligence, General Frank McKenzie in December 2021, just months after the withdrawal, testified to Congress, and he said that our intelligence gathering capabilities in Afghanistan and the region, particularly in Afghanistan, were 1% to 2% of what it was when the U.S. was present in country.
So you're saying like 98%, 98% worse.
Yes, and I can't imagine that that's improved. Tell a quick story about just how good our intelligence capabilities were while we were in Afghanistan. We were told there were only 50 to 100 Al Qaeda in Afghanistan consistently from 2010 to late 2015. Then we conducted a raid in eastern Afghanistan, gathered intelligence, and found out Al Qaeda was running training camps in Kandahar provinces, where the Department of Defense and the U.S. intelligence community telling us Al Qaeda was not there, and killed well over 150 to 200 Al Qaeda fighters during that operation. That's how bad our intelligence was at the time while we were there.
I mean, the proof's in the pudding, right? There's been, near as I can tell, one over-the-horizon strike since we left Afghanistan. The al-Zawahiri, which was a big deal in 2022. But I mean, this was sold to the American people as sort of, this is going to be kind of the new secret weapon that we have in the war on terror. Over the horizon will come from all corners of the globe if we sense terrorist activity in Afghanistan, and it just hasn't materialized.
They said the first year after they talked about that, when the Zawahiri strike occurred, right before that occurred, we were spending $19 billion a year on that over-the-horizon strike capability. That is, look, great. If it's worth $19 billion a year to get Zawahiri, that's maybe a good investment for 1 year. We're 2.5 years later. Where is this money going? What is it actually being used for? This is not a good return on our investment if 19 billion plus 2 times 2.5, and we've gotten one Al Qaeda leader. And Al Qaeda is capable of replacing those leaders.
Bill, I want to get to Iran and Israel. And it seems, of course, the threat of a direct Israel-Iran war has subsided a bit from where it was a week or two ago. So that's good. But the threat from Iran's network of militias and its proxy terror groups across the region remains as high as ever, of course, from Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and their campaign to disrupt international shipping, militias in Iraq and Syria, and on and on and on. Is it possible, you think, Bill, for whether this administration or any administration for the United States, can we develop, if we wanted to, a holistic approach to dismantle and defeat the entirety of Iran's proxy network? If we had that kind of broad strategy, could we do it if we wanted to?
You know, what I've learned with covering these wars for almost 2 decades, it's about will. And unfortunately, our enemies seem to possess a lot of will. All of our enemies have been underdogs. Like, the Taliban is the ultimate underdog story. And if the script was flipped, we'd be celebrating the Taliban, but they happen to be evil monsters. We do not possess the will that needs to be done. The reality is with Iran and its terror networks, what it calls the axis of resistance. If you want to tackle that, you need to tackle, the center, the spider that's building the web, and that is Iran. You need to develop a policy to deal with it, and that would mean essentially regime change in Iran. I'm not advocating this, by the way, given how poorly we've done this in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in Libya and other places. But that is what would need to be done here. And that takes will, and that takes time, and it takes effort, and it takes sacrifice. And these are the things that we haven't shown to possess in the last 2 decades. We operate on election cycles, and our enemies operate on timeframes of decades and generations.
Bill, Last thing here, we all sort of remember, the post 9/11 war on terror era, the idea of quote unquote winning hearts and minds, across the Muslim world. Eh, Have we lost that war? All these countries we're talking about here, I'm curious where the hearts and minds of the people are with respect to some of these groups. Is there a significant part of the Somali population that's on al-Shabaab's side? We've seen polling that suggests plenty of Palestinians in Gaza back Hamas, at least to some degree. Across the Sahel, a lot of these groups try to cast themselves as being able to provide for local populations in the way that the traditional failed governments there haven't been able to. So how did we end up here? Could we have done anything differently with that hearts and minds argument over the past 2 decades, or is this sort of always just the way it was destined to turn out?
Back to our, election cycles versus our enemies' decades. That's us operating. I call it McWar, right? We want to pull into the drive-through, get our victory, pull away, and leave these countries. It doesn't work that way. And local populations. I always said with Afghanistan, for instance, many Afghans began to sit on the fence. And it wasn't because we conducted a raid in their village and it killed civilians. It's because we conducted a raid in their village and killed civilians. Then we left. And then the Taliban came back. And then we did the same thing. Watch, rinse, repeat. They didn't see any success to our efforts so we never defeated the Taliban. And then when we would go in and try to do something, we did it half-assed, dare I say. We didn't have the staying power to defeat our enemy and win these wars. Now, Afghanistan, complicated. You had Pakistan, and to a lesser extent, Iran serving as safe haven, supporting the Taliban and Al Qaeda, et cetera, et cetera. But we never did what we needed to do. And over time, that just erodes the will of those who want to take our side. It puts them on the fence, or it could even turn them against us in some aspects. I spent a lot of time embedding with Iraqi forces, and there were a lot of Iraqis who hated Al Qaeda and who wanted to defeat Al Qaeda and wanted a better country for themselves. But we abandoned them. After what we withdrew, we invaded in 2003 and left in 2011. It wasn't enough, and you're not going to win hearts and minds by abandoning the people you promised to support.
Bill Roggio, thank you so much for joining us here in the Threat Status Podcast.
Gentlemen, thanks. It's a real pleasure.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week. This is a weekly segment where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's domestically here at home or in some corner of the world that we think is threatening you, the American people, the listeners, right now. And Guy, in fact, mine is domestic this week, because my threat of the week is anti-Semitism on college campuses in the United States. And we have seen some pretty remarkable scenes at major American colleges and universities over the past few months, but especially in the past week or two, as students protest against Israel's war in Gaza, and they say in support of the Palestinian people. We've seen hundreds of arrests from USC to Emerson College, University of Texas at Austin, and elsewhere. The current epicenter seems to be at Columbia University in New York City, where demonstrators have essentially built a tent city on campus, and they've almost ground the school to a halt. As Columbia says, they're offering remote learning options for final exams and other steps so students can essentially avoid coming to campus. They say they want the university to divest itself from anything related to Israel and take other steps to show their displeasure with the Netanyahu government in Israel and how it's conducted the war against Hamas in Gaza. Anti-war activism, of course, has a long history on college campuses. You can go all the way back to Kent State and even before that. But what's new and dangerous here is there seems to be a current of anti-Semitism that's bubbling beneath the surface, and in some cases has just come right out into the open. We've seen reports of Jewish students fearing for their own safety. We've seen reports of anti-Semitic slurs hurled at Jewish students. In some instances, the language we've seen from protesters seems to be bordering on outright pro-Hamas sentiment, which is outrageous for a host of reasons, including this is a group that, according to the United Nations, engaged in the gang rape of Israeli civilians on October 7th, in addition to killing over 1,200 people. We should point out here, a lot of these protesters don't seem to actually be students at the schools. It seems like these demonstrations have attracted a lot of outside actors, and near as we can tell, they're to blame for at least a good part of the ugliness here. But big picture, you can sympathize with innocent civilians who have lost their lives. You can even object to Israel and its tactics. The U.S. government does that. We've had U.S. officials like Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer call for a new prime minister in Israel because of how they're conducting this war. But there is, or there should be, a pretty clear dividing line between objecting to policies or objecting to a government and how it prosecutes a war versus offering tacit support for a terrorist group and in the process making Jewish students fear for their lives in America in 2024. It's a threat right now, Guy, because unfortunately throughout history, we've seen that when this kind of ugly rhetoric starts and this snowball starts to roll down the hill, it's really, really hard to stop. And sometimes people die. So let's hope that we've seen the worst of this.
Let's hope so, Ben. My thread of the week is a little bit different, and it's about the rise of Chinese organized crime in Mexico. The U.S.-Mexico border crisis is always in the headlines, but the surge of connectivity between elite-level Chinese mafia groups and the Mexican cartels gets very little attention. The connection between China and Mexico and the fentanyl crisis is well documented. Chinese criminal syndicates have for years smuggled illegal fentanyl precursors into Mexico, where Mexican cartels then make fentanyl and smuggle it north into the United States. What's less understood is how deep China's organized criminal activities have gotten in Mexico and really across Latin America in recent years. Last week, I discussed this in depth in a Threat Status Influencers video interview with Brookings Institution senior fellow Vanda Felbob Brown, pretty much the preeminent expert in the Washington think tank world on global organized crime. In the interview, Vanda explains how Chinese criminal groups have deepened their hold on a range of activities with the Mexican cartels, with a special role in global money laundering operations for the cartels, and even illegal trafficking of exotic, often nearly extinct wildlife. I asked Vanda Felbob Brown about the issue of connectivity between the Chinese Communist government and these criminal activities, specifically whether the CCP uses Chinese organized crime and the fentanyl crisis to exert leverage over the United States government. She said it's a good question. It's also clearly a sensitive and secretive issue. Here's actually what she had to say in the interview.
I'm asked all the time, is China using fentanyl as asymmetric warfare against the United States? And the answer is, with absolute certainty, I can say I don't know. Whoever has the wiretap to the Politburo can know the answer.
Ben, you can watch the whole Threat Status Influencers video with Vanda Felbob Brown on the Threat Status page at WashingtonTimes.com. There are several interesting nuggets in it. She also talks about linkages between Russian intelligence and Mexican drug cartels. But generally, my threat of the week is the rise of Chinese organized crime in Mexico.
An underreported story, for sure, but an important one. So thanks very much for that. And thank you all for listening once again here to the Threat Status Podcast. Thank you to Bill Roggio for joining us on this week's episode. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, and we will see you all again next week.